Hi there, thanks for downloading the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. You can find out more at fantasy-animation.org, as well as via our social media channels on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research. If you like what you see, then please do support the show by subscribing, liking and reviewing the show. A quick written review, 5 stars, would be really, really helpful. It helps make the visibility of the programme even more. It helps us reach more listeners and it helps justify what we're doing to our employers. So please take a minute out of your life to help the show. It would really help us create more content for you. Otherwise, sit back, relax and enjoy the latest episode. Hi again, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, this is the year where we make amends. We have dabbled in franchises in the past, and we've started quite a lot of them, but we've got about one film into many of them and then stopped. I think this is the year where we clean up our mess and we fix the problem. So today, listeners, we will be doing Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, the second in the Harry Potter franchise. We have done the Sorcerer's/Philosopher's Stone. Find it in the archive. By all means, start there before you listen to this recording. And we do have more Harry Potter films to follow in our recording schedule. So we're going to get this thing done, Chris. But on the Chamber, we've got a very special guest I'll introduce in just a second to help us do that. But just on the Chamber of Secrets, Chris, any quick thoughts on the status of VFX, animation, all things, computery that you like to talk about? What's going on with this film that you might want to keep what listeners might want to think about as we have this conversation?
The computery stuff definitely sounds like something that I would talk about. I would say that I'm really interested in this Harry Potter and the Temple of Doom. Sorry, Chamber of Secrets. So I'd like to talk about that. But no, I've got a few little notes on, of course, Dobby, and I think there's something significant about the film's 2002-ness, which links to perhaps some conversations we've had when we've done another franchise that we've not finished, which is Lord of the Rings. So a bit on that. I'd also like to talk a lot about the flying Ford Anglia and the representation of London, and particularly King's Cross. I'm increasingly fascinated by King's Cross, St Pancras, it's sort of as a space of magic, and so I'm going to go on a little bit of a detour, I guess, this episode. And yes, I'll talk about Dobby/Gollum, but I will also talk about King's Cross, and also I think VFX about being seen. I think there's something really interesting about the car as a sort of visible VFX that in the film itself there's discussions about bringing the world of magic into disrepute because one is seeing the effect. So I think there's something interesting about that.
Cool. Looking forward to all that. I've got, I've got the distinction between Dobby and Gollum. I've got branding, because with our guest interests in mind, and world building and identities of different worlds and tone and the relationship between imagination, tone, fantasy and childhood. Oh, we've got lots to unpack. We better get going. So, to help us do all that, don't worry, it's not just us two. We have a very special guest with us today, Professor Jyotsna Kapur. Jyotsna is a professor of cinema and media studies at the University of Southern Illinois. She also works in the sociology department. Her research and teaching interests include Marxist-feminist theory of media, arts and culture, the politics of labour, class, race, and sexuality in neoliberalism, contemporary Indian media and culture, the history and theory of the documentary, third cinema, and global children's media culture. She's the author of 2 key books in this regard. There's The Politics of Time and Youth in Brand India, and Coining for Capital, Movies, Marketing, and the Transformation of Childhood. She's also the co-editor of Neoliberalism and Global Cinema, Capital Culture, and Marxist Critique. So, Jyotsna, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. Very excited to have this conversation with the two of you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited to have it with you too. Right, where shall we start? Let's start You've written on Harry Potter. It comes up in your writing a few times. Let's start with what angle we're looking at Harry Potter today through, because I think you've got a particular set of interests that complement, but also kind of take us in a new direction to think about the franchise. So let's start with, you approach these things from the perspective of kind of Marxist critical cultural critique, and particularly in relation to children's culture. So just unpack some of that for our listeners who perhaps might know some of these words, but not all of them.
Okay. Just a little background. I started thinking very deeply about the relationship between childhood and capital in the 90s when I had two young kids in that decade. And so it really got me thinking very deeply about how childhood was actually being reinvented. So we were watching these films like, so Home Alone was came a year before my first child was born. But we were seeing in these films children looking and acting like adults and adults acting and looking like children, and sort of commodification of childhood, which is that there was this whole range of things you could buy for kids, stores like Toys R Us and all of that. And at the same time, benefits for children or social protections around children were being eviscerated. So this is the Clinton era in the United States. I had been in the U.S. I was a grad student. I was still new to the country. And so I think I could I came to know capitalism in a very intimate way, not, as I'd known it in a different context growing up in India, but sort of seeing the seductions of consumer culture were new.
Interesting.
Right? And so what I saw happening in the 90s was that at the conservative level, the conservatives on both sides, so I would call them both the right, so the marketing executives and so on, were saying children are no different from adults. We should be able to market to them just like we market to adults. So the regulations on television were removed. The other hand, the conservatives were saying this is terrible. Children, women have started to go to work. The family's coming apart. We need stricter regimens around children. So on the surface, it seems like contradictory what's going on with these conservatives. And on the one hand, they want to protect childhood, and on the other, they want to sell to children. And I saw that contradiction as a sort of fundamental contradiction. But the basic thing that was common across was that children were no different from adults. Nobody deserves a free lunch. That's true. So everyone should be able to take care of themselves, including children. So what we were seeing in the movies was a kind of rehearsal for what was actually happening in society. And this, as a young mother, that really disturbed me. And because you kind of are seeing what it actually means, that children don't deserve indulgence or protection. It's sort of very visceral. So I think that's the point from where I started, was the relationship of capital to children is that protections given to children are going to be withdrawn, while childhood becomes a commodity that is anybody who can purchase it can experience it.
Because I was really interested in reading your stuff on Harry Potter and the kind of commercialization of children's culture. How, I suppose, what struck me before the Harry Potter stuff, if you like, was the points that you make around kind of what cinema's looking like in this period. And you say that and you mentioned Home Alone and its sequel, but a lot of the films where you say, well, there's the importance of the children or the family film are often you mentioned The Lion King, and earlier on in one of your pieces for Jump Cut, you talk about Toy Story. So it's really interesting, and fantasy obviously is central to that. So it's really interesting that your examples, I suppose, with our with our boring academic hats on, it's like, well, you're talking about family films and children's films, but you're also talking about animation. And Alex would say, yes, but you're also talking about fantasy. So it's really interesting what you say, where we're actually dealing with a topic that's perhaps the strongest bond that connects fantasy films often being animated films leaning on fantasy, children's films often being both of those things, fantasy films and animated films often being geared or being understood critically and culturally as for children. So it's really interesting, this discussions around high concept cinema, children's cinema, the family film, that just seems right for this kind of, you know, it's in the Venn diagram between fantasy and animation, really. The stuff that you're kind of talking about, and as you started talking about the commercialization, of course, I went to Toy Story anyway because of the way that film was sold, but also the tie-ins that the film then prompts. So I think this is really interesting, and I know that, you know, Alex is written on Hook, for example, and interested in Hook around this. So I think this is a really intriguing sort of point of collision that I don't think we've spoken about a lot actually on the podcast, really.
So, Chris, yes. So what was happening in the 90s, and I think how this relates very deeply with animation when we look at children, is like a reconceptualization of the relationship children have with toys.
Yeah.
So if we think of animation as basically animating an object, and giving life to it, breathing life into it through narratives that are, that you produce. So children have always, in that sense, animated toys, and they've made toys, right? And they've picked up anything and made it into a toy. I think what's so striking with the commercialization of childhood, with telling them that the way to be is to be a consumer, is that they're being told, even with Harry Potter, buy this collector's item, which was also with Beanie Babies, like these two books that came in the middle between the fourth and the fifth Harry Potter. They were like Harry Potter's notebooks. And buy these as collector items, meaning speculate in the future when you will sell this in the market. And that's that Mugglish reality, where you think of everything in terms, like play itself is being transformed from keeping things in their boxes properly so that you can sell them in the market at a later time. And I think in some ways, animation becomes actually more and more naturalistic or realistic. And just before so for me, Chris Columbus's 1 and 2, part 1 and the two first films are more like video games. They're more like seeing how things can be animated on a screen. Whereas I think the third film does open up space and time in a way that the first two don't. But the last thing I wanted to say is when you change the relationship of children to toys as toys are commodities, these stories become commercials for things you can buy. So you can buy everything that is there in the Harry Potter one. You can buy the broom, the Quidditch thing. You can buy a bed sheet. So I had this experience. I had a student see one of Miyazaki's films. I was teaching a class on children and cinema, and the student said, "Where can I buy this?" And I was like, "No, you can't buy this object from the film." And it was like the whole thing had completely changed. So owning these commodities, but not disturbing them, not breaking them, and not making any kind of new thing out of it, which in a way, like kind of deadening the imagination or the relationship children would have to play.
Yeah. It's also actually, now as you say that, and thinking about the timeline of when Chamber of Secrets comes out, which is 2002, quite a lot of what you're talking about is it's not even you can buy this. It's actually imagine if you could buy this. A lot of the aesthetic of the film, which has then been codified and commercialized by the fact you now can buy it. But at the time, we didn't have Harry Potter world. We didn't have the shop at King's Cross Chris is referring to. We didn't have these theme park spaces, or I mean, I can remember as when these films came out, you know, the sweets that the kids are eating slowly start coming out. The broomsticks start. The merchandise kind of follows ancillary to the films as they always do. And it takes a bit of time. It's a bit sluggish. The market's a bit sluggish. So actually, it's about, it's not only the denial of the imagination. It's almost a corruption of the imagination, because a lot of the imaginative spirit of these movies, particularly these early movies, and it hadn't struck me till I read your work, how apparent this is a lot of how fun it would be if I could own this, if I could own this broomstick, if I could buy these sweets, and then the commercial ancillary activity that follows seems kind of makes the fantasy true. Now you can buy it. So there's almost an in-between stage between what you're talking about even there, where the fantasy of the movie is being used to stimulate commercial desire, not just some of a more kind of abstract desire.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the first two really are setting up children to buy those things, and in that they actually take away the magic of the books. Like I really did love both Harry Potter, the first two, because it seemed to go against the grain of like this kind of cinema, right? Which was like, there is no magic when the toys in Toy Story become real. They're just talking about they're like little middle managers who are, talking about plastic corrosion and how to stay together and not become obsolete, and Beanie Babies retire and so on. But Harry Potter, it constructs this notion of magic, the possibility of another sort of world where children learn from each other. There are some adults, there are all sorts of adults, but there are also adults who know, adults who are ready to die for you. I mean, the mother dying for Harry in the first, the parents dying for Harry in the first one, and in the second, Dumbledore comes to the rescue at the end. And, and what is evil is, if you go for pure blood, and that's what's evil. So the story actually is very mythic. It kind of brings these myths that we have in contemporary terms. So whereas Home Alone, the parents are not bad, they're just forgetful. They just forget the kid, and here they die for the child. And I think so that there was this magic in the book, which was then simplified with the films. And the third one, there does go into the magic part. So like with Chambers of Secrets, the whole beginning, which is always saying that it's Harry's birthday and everybody just ignores him and humiliates him. In the book, Rowling really does draw it out that, till the point where finally the owl comes in and then the masons run out and it's a barn owl. In the film, it's simplified. Like the real sort of emotional tenor of the story is simplified with this emphasis on objects.
So it's part of what you're saying there is that this commercialization, because there's bits of that in the books, isn't there? I can certainly remember all the broomstick chatter, and there's lots of now Harry's got a better broomstick stuff, and the sweets and all this sort of stuff. So it's not there in the books, but you're saying that kind of part of the problem is the way the film, the way these books get adapted is obviously they get simplified so that the whole narrative can be fit in, and what's sacrificed is I don't know, tonal complexity, and what we get instead is a kind of set of spectacle. Spectacle is the thing that kind of is replaced with nuanced, right? We get the same scene, but the emphasis is instead on the effect, the owl, the moment of visual pleasure, rather than character relations, plot, the kind of more kind of interpersonal stuff. And is that does that go throughout the movie then? Is that a trend you see throughout the Chamber of Secrets more broadly?
Well, I was glad Chris mentioned Dobby, because I think Dobby does come out as a sympathetic character. If there is someone you have a little sympathy with, who you can identify with, rather than the spectacle, okay, let's see this owl, let's see the stairs, let's see this, let's see the nimbus.
Let's have the Quidditch scene.
Right, like at the end, when Malfoy kicks Dobby, then you feel like like he should be rescued. So there's some heart to it.
Should we talk about?
I'm curious what Chris thinks about Dobby.
Yeah, we should talk about Dobby, because it did not strike me until rewatching this movie that, of course, 2002 is the year where 2 CGI grey gnomes capture everyone's hearts. Gollum, of course, from Lord of the Rings, who we can talk to on another podcast. But now we'll talk about Dobby. So it's an interesting character, because I would agree with you. I think Dobby is the character that kind of feels fleshed out, and of course there's no flesh on the screen. Yes. So Chris, what were your thoughts on Dobby as our VFX expert?
Well, I would say it's funny that we're talking about the characters of Harry Potter, because I also, I think the characters is often, we can talk about the magic and the fantasy, but sure. I always felt that the characters, who was going to be there's the range of different characters, and I think one of the later films, when you get these kind of competitions and Triwizard tournaments and all these competing schools, it really fleshes out the world through different kinds of characters. And I think Star Wars is certainly the same, and Lord of the Rings, really character driven franchises, but as well as being spaces of VFX as well. But I'd forgotten that Dobby was in this one. I was getting a bit confused between. I was trying to think: is this the first time we've seen Quidditch? No, that's in the first film, and all the beats that one does in these films, the generic scenes, the bit before the return to Hogwarts, the first class, the new teacher that's always like quote unquote the villain. But the extra bit to this is who's the British actor who's going to be cast in it. So these films have an extra layer of characterization, because there's the real pleasure in who's joining the franchise, and you get that because of the way that the films follow the school years. It just gives them the perfect excuse. Gives Rowling, gives whoever's directing it, David Yates, Columbus, Cuaron, gives the excuse to introduce the new teacher of the new year, or the new, and that structure is really conducive to bringing in all these new characters. Dobby is this really iconic character that doesn't sit within that structure, because he's essentially part of the intrusive fantasy, if I understand the term from Alex correctly, that he's the magic that shouldn't be there. And obviously that plays out in the way that the film is produced. He's not really there. It is a tennis ball on a stick and all this kind of stuff. Sure. But his intrusion into the world of Privet Drive happens really early on, much earlier on than I remembered, and he's initially really disruptive in a way that I hadn't really remembered too. So I think he's an interesting character, one, because he kind of connects the film up to something like Lord of the Rings, and this moment of VFX integration that was kind of convincing and three-dimensional and felt fleshed out. And he's one of the digital characters in one of 3 or 4, and maybe slightly less, digital characters where there's real interaction. So whereas some characters like the basilisk, or I suppose even the big spider, which is animatronic, you get something like Dobby, which feels really connected to Harry, where they're kind of fighting with each other, and I felt that way with Gollum as well when we did Lord of the Rings. This idea that they're not just coexisting in a scene, but you kind of know that they're always going to be separate. There's the classic oil and water that they can look like they're going to mix, but they'll never mix. Whereas actually the film tries to make Gollum feel really material by having a consequence on the world, that he's tangible, that when he bangs his head, it sounds like a three-dimensional heavy object. So I think the intrusion is not just an intrusion of fantasy, but it seems like he's having a material aspect on the conditions of that fantasy world, and also of the real world, and also Harry himself, that they're kind of doing more than just sharing a scene. They're kind of impacting each other And I think that's where the success of the character lies. Same with Gollum as well. I think the sort of integration of the hobbits and so a landmark, I would say, in the film's 2002-ness, definitely.
Dobby's also got a kind of... Now, I haven't read the books for quite a few years, so correct me if perhaps I'm barking up the wrong tree here. But to me, Dobby also struck me as having a far more... in the books, he's quite a pathetic creature, and I mean that in the sort of real sense of the word. He doesn't attribute our disdain, but there's something almost abject about Dobby in the books. There's something so pitiful and morose that there's almost a kind of hairs on the back of your neck affect to reading the creature. And I don't think that's true of the cinematic incarnation. There's a much more kind of cutesy, dare I say, almost childlike quality to Dobby that I think might be part of its kind of attractional aesthetic, right? It's this effect, because essentially it is an effect, is trying to kind of solicit our belief, or solicit our willingness to kind of infuse these digital sprites with matter through a kind of appeal to our kind of empathy. And I think the character's a lot more rounded off as he comes across in the film. Not to say that he's not interesting and arresting, but I found him a much more cutesy presence than I remember the Dobby from the books being.
So if I can go out on a limb here. So if what is happening in this period is a sort of deconstruction of childhood, like it's deconstructing it, then children themselves see childhood as a museum object.
Interesting.
I see this with my students and, my kids. Like, it's like they think of each period in their lives, they attach it to a brand or a franchise. Or when I was a kid, there was Harry Potter. We went to the midnight, book release here in town. And then there was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So in some ways, and this thing of speculating for the future with toys, it sets in this thing of nostalgia very early in our lives, because you're already thinking this is going to pass till there's the next franchise or whatever. So I do see in animation, in this film and otherwise, like these old creatures, but they look like children, which like babies initially do look like newborns do look sort of old and crinkly and stuff. But, we don't like take pictures of them, and we don't our idea of children is like they're sort of cute or like infants. But Dobby, I agree, is this sort of old child.
So what?
Who gets
why
kicked
though?
around.
Why is that though? Is it to compare against a different kind of childhood embodied by Harry and Ron, and who are sort of ostensibly they're not adults, but they behave, because going back to your point about children's rights and children's film and family films being able to show changes and children not deserving any special treatments, whether or not these films are going, well, we'll treat the childish lead, or the children who are playing the leads, as ostensibly adults, and we'll use Dobby as a sort of a way of negotiating a different kind of childhood. Is that why he's portrayed in this way, this character?
Let's take the term unconscious, and from Walter Benjamin, the idea of the optic unconscious, that we can see things which we can't see with the eye, but we're sort of aware of it. That's how I understand it. So like we can't, we see a seed and we see a flower. We don't see the process in which that happens, but we're aware of it. Somehow it's in our unconscious. I think seeing this kind of old child in children's cinema is that sort of unconscious awareness children are having at this time, that they're being pushed to grow up.
Okay, so if we're saying that the film is trying to push children to grow up, or Dobby embodies that desire, or that kind of unconscious, let's say, it's interesting that there are also two pivotal characters in the film that are engaging with a question of childhood versus adulthood, which is Tom Riddle and Moaning Myrtle. So Tom Riddle he says later on, that Voldemort is his past, or his past is his present, I think he says, or something to that effect, with the reveal that Tom Riddle is Voldemort. And then the second is Moaning Myrtle, who is a child, played by an older actress, Shirley Henderson, but is essentially a child in the film and has been kind of crystallized as such and petrified in her own way, because she is a ghost who will not grow up. And so it's interesting that two pivotal characters in the film are sort of connected to this idea of children growing up or not growing up, or being pushed to grow up, or what do they grow up into, or in the case of Myrtle, not growing up at all. So I just wondered whether those two characters fit into some of the things that you're saying, that childhood itself is being reallocated to lots of different characters, whether it's and ironically probably not the three main characters. It's being presented through Dobby, and it's being presented in these other characters. So I just wondered if Myrtle and Tom Riddle fit into some of the things or the conclusions that we could maybe draw about what the film is saying in relation to childhood.
In this film, what I think is, again, goes counter to that trend. So it's a contradictory film, text. It's not just like, okay, let's speed up the growing up of children, but it in some ways mourns it, in some ways it looks at it, it distances ourselves from it. So it has a continuity with the past, which we didn't see with other work in this time around children. So relationship with parents, the Weasley family, and then reinventing the past in one way, which is like the wizards are purebloods versus like this other idea that Harry represents. So it is like also struggling about the past. Tom Riddle, I think, yes, it's this evil, which has this kind of eternal quality of return. And he's then killed with, the book disappeared, the book is murdered. So this memory is being destroyed at that moment. But we know he'll reappear. Mourning Myrtle, I find actually this thing of accepting a dead child as normal. Now, like from all of our childhoods, we know there are all these stories around toilets and bathrooms, right? That is something that is old. But this dead child who whines, who cries, which is accepted, to me is, I am conflicted about how to read it, because partly it seems like this, okay, children have grown up and their toys are, whatever, talking about their companies. So on the one hand, it seems that's fine. Dead children, we just coexist with dead children, which, the film came out in 2003, not to get too historically, not to connect it directly, but the war against Iraq was, done at that time. There were protests here. Children were participating in those protests. I sort of cite a speech from a 13-year-old in my book, who says, don't think of Iraq as Saddam, think about the children there. So you're seeing children become active to kind of protect childhood in a way. So on the one hand, this Mourning Myrtle is like a dead child who now we accept. But on the other hand, it can also distance. It's also scary. Like Hermione doesn't go to that bathroom, she says, because there's a ghost over there. So there's something still scary about a dead child.
Yeah, there's something eerie about Moaning Myrtle that isn't true of the other ghosts that we see in the movie of adults, and I wonder if it's as you're saying. A comparative text that's jumping into my mind to compare some of this to is, as we're talking about kind of childhood and children lamenting their own childhood as the process goes through, is the class sort of Peter Pan, which I know sort of Jacqueline Rose in particular, but many others have sort of argued is a story essentially about people, kids pretending to be kids, right? It's Peter, the Lost Boys. They're sort of already not children in the film. The whole thing is about kind of Peter and Wendy's pubescent romance, their emerging sexuality, and what they're doing is a big game where they pretend like they won't grow up, right? That even though they sort of already have, to the extent that they can recognise that they're no longer kids anymore. The difference is that obviously in Peter Pan, that's kind of part of the kind of, you know, British romantic tradition, and there's an elegy kind of running throughout the whole thing. It's a sort of, you know, Dylan Thomas-esque, you know, dying of the light kind of mournful quality. In this, I think the film is very pleased when kids are acting like adults, right? That's kind of part of the joy of these movies, particularly these kind of early movies, which kind of play like almost kind of like famous 5 murder mysteries in Hogwarts, right? Where the kids are solving the puzzle that the adults clearly, you know, Dumbledore hasn't even bothered to ask why this child ghost has been crying in the toilet for the past, I don't know how, you know, 60, 70 years she's been in there. The adults don't seem anywhere, but the kids, because they're better adults than adults, can work it out, can solve the mystery, can creep down corridors and pack up lunches and look after themselves and all this kind of stuff. So there's a much more kind of by celebratory quality to, or to put it another way, the normal childhood, and I'm using air quotes, that the film seems to celebrate is not childhood, is exactly to kind of fit to your argument that it's actually it's when children are behaving like adults that the film's most pleased with them.
Right. And I'm glad you bring up Jacqueline Rose, because she talks about how Peter Pan is turned into a children's book by removing that sort of epilogue where it's a seductive tale being told by a grown-up to a child. And so you just sort of remove that part, the foreword or whatever, to turn it into a children's book to fit this century where childhood is being invented, and you know, it's that golden period of childhood, and children are seen as these. Their only role is to play and to study. You know, they're being, and childhood is being imagined as this state. But when we are in a period where these protections are being taken away from children, from like future generations, then you know, a text can't help, but it'll maybe mourn it, but it'll also celebrate it. It'll,
My question then to throw out is, Alex, you're saying that the film is very pleased at the moments where the children are not being children at all, or let's say they're being adults. Are they not children who are having to? So the film is reflexive about their process of having to adopt adult qualities, because the adults in the film, or the protectors in the film, are often drawn and painted quite broadly, whether it's the Weasleys or whether it's the Dursleys, or even Draco trying to essentially model himself after his father, which is something that really starts to unravel or unfold, let's say, in the next few films, because a lot of the films are about dynasty and are about not being like your father or being just like your father and all this sort of stuff. So is there a sense in the films that the films themselves are showing adults having to assume the role of sorry, are the films saying that the films are showing children, that are having to adopt adult qualities because they kind of have to, so rather than them just being adults and the film or the writers writing them like adults, is there any sort of, the way that the adults are presented in the films gives us a sense that the children are kind of are being pushed into these roles by the lack of father figures or the lack of parental figures or the absence of parental. I'm just trying to get my head around whether or not we think the films are doing that kind of reflexive work about children having to just assume those roles because there aren't any, or they think this is what being an adult is like.
Right. But I think that's where this film is interesting. So all fairy tales and children's stories have the kid taking care of itself at the end. That's part of growing up, and that's the allure or fantasy of narratives for children. What we're seeing in the from the 90s is like what Chris is saying, the adults are incapable of being adults, and so the children have to do it on their own. A film like Jumanji is a great example of that. I think what this film shows is both. So the adult who's incapable of being an adult, who does not deserve respect or any love, are the Dursleys, that uncle and Aunt Petunia and I'm forgetting his name.
Yeah.
Vernon.
Vernon, yeah.
They're like, they're fat or too thin, and they're just, they're very narrow. Their whole goal is to just be upwardly mobile, and they can't take care of this child. So the Muggles world has these type of adults, whereas I think in Hogwarts there's a range of adults, including then adults like for Chambers of Secret. Adults like Dumbledore who say, if you stay loyal to me, help will come. And they really look up. And even Hagrid, he has this quirk or whatever of going for large animals, but it's still an adult you can learn from. So I think this Harry Potter splits it up, that Muggles world, which is presented to us as the normal world in other films, and then this magic world. Yeah. And part of the magic is that adults do act like adults, and children grow up, but not having to kind of also rescue adults, because that's another sort of narrative that develops in films like Jumanji, where the children have to not only end the game, they have to save the adult.
I was wondering whether that's... if we think about the way that the film frames events through childhood or children, that's where the film is at its most. That's when I see Harry and Hermione and Ron as at their most childlike. Is I can totally imagine that's they do see teachers as functional. They don't know what the teachers get up to outside of the classroom. So that's where the film almost adopts the point of view. And you do get it actually in this film through, this point of view shots from behind the that magical cloak, the invisibility cloak thing, that you're having a view on the school through the children. So you're discovering new teachers and new classes and new spells and all this kind of stuff. But you only ever see them really in the corridors and in the classroom. And that's sort of true to life. And so I don't think that's a criticism of a way that the characters are kind of drawn and created and represented. It's just... Maybe it's just a narrative tool, and then it's very out of functionality comes the economy of so we already know the different and also you get a lot of teachers in the film getting replaced by, even in this film, Gilderoy Lockhart is the new Defence Against the Dark Arts. So there's just roles that these people inhabit, these different roles across every school year that these adults inhabit, and that's presumably how children see it. That these are three children that are in a classroom that are just learning the subject, but it doesn't necessarily matter by who, because the adults just kind of come and go. So I'd not really thought about adults as being this really interesting connection, but also separation between these two worlds. Yes, they're sort of farcical. The Dursleys are farcical in the start of the film, and the subject of physical comedy in a way that the adults in Hogwarts are definitely not. But there's sort of more to it, the way that the film, through the child's, I don't think it's subjectivity, but certainly an allegiance to the children, who are often in every scene as well, that they have to. There's a way which, of course, that's how the film paints teachers, because they only ever see them in term time, and often the films end with them leaving and going back for the holidays and all that kind of stuff. So. Yeah, I think adults are a really interesting point of connection that I've not really. Should
we talk about the flying car? Because I feel like that was something you flagged up, Chris, in the introduction you wanted to get to, and it seems to bring a lot of some of these threads that we're pulling at here together. In that, well, Chris, you talk to me about the car, and we'll see what the three of us do with it.
Well, I suppose. When I talk about the car, what I really want to talk about is King's Cross, and I've always found it interesting that the departure of Hogwarts, the Hogwarts Express, is at King's Cross, and I run a project with my students about the redevelopment of King's Cross. That it's prior to when the film. So this book comes out, I think, in 1998, and then the film is a few years later. So this is the time when the whole area of King's Cross is being regenerated. You have the transformation of its industrial history into a vibrant city quarter. London Canal Museum opens in 92. British Library opens in 1997. Guardian and Observer newspaper headquarters moved to the area. At the time, the British Library was the largest public building constructed in the UK across the 20th century. You then have the development of King's Cross as the area. So King's Cross, this transformation of 65 acres of former railway lands into King's Cross Central. So this new, expansive, modern, it was badged as the King's Cross Opportunity Area. The King's Cross Development Forum was set up at this time that allowed kind of local communities to sort of who lived and worked in Camden and Islington to kind of contribute to the development process. Now, since then, there's been a lot of writing around whether this was who was this a renaissance for. But I think if you visit the area now, you will see it looks, in fact, it looks very different to how it used to look in the 70s and 80s, where a lot of films about the area, it was too dangerous to film there, so they had to film elsewhere. So there are films, Mona Lisa is a good example, starring Bob Hoskins, that is about King's Cross and the red light district, but it was too dangerous to film there, so they filmed somewhere else. So it's kind of exemplifying it's kind of social issue that it's kind of talking about. So the area was connected to decay and so forth. Now, part of its regeneration comes through travel and the fact that King's Cross is now this centre of international connection, because Eurostar moves from Waterloo up to King's Cross, but it's also the tube line with the most... Sorry, it's the station with the most tube line connections. So it's always been this trait. So it makes perfect sense that Hogwarts would leave from there, because everything leaves from there. That's your entrance into London from abroad. So you get off the Eurostar and that's where you land. It's the place where you often go up north. I get the high-speed service down to Kent from King's Cross. So it makes perfect sense that King's Cross St Pancras would be this area where Harry Potter is departing from. But as you alluded to earlier on, like it's now an area that's become a tourist attraction. So you go there to have your picture taken in front of platform 9 3/4, which isn't where it was in the film, which is between platforms 3 and 4. It's actually there's a trolley that's half in the wall that you can have your picture taken. So the students are interested in this area because it's not just a train station where you transit through. It's now a destination in and of itself, and Harry Potter is in absolute conversation with that, and this film in particular, because you have the repeated spectacle of them trying to get through the wall, and they can't do it because the portal is closed. But you have the flying car. You have the flying car that ironically, because King's Cross hadn't quite been developed yet, the exterior of King's Cross is St Pancras in the film. And even though they're different stations, we hadn't got to the point where King's Cross Central was the fancy, shiny, concrete jungle, smooth, I would say, concrete jungle, not the nice modern version of concrete jungle where all the designs are trying to evoke these gas cylinders. It didn't quite look like that yet, so they ironically had to shoot all that footage of the car flying outside of St Pancras rather than King's Cross. So I'm really interested in this area and what these films sort of did for the commerce of King's Cross St Pancras as part of its redevelopment, but also how the Harry Potter films are kind of central to the station's transformation, and not just a place that you move through. There are very few seats around because you don't spend time there. You move through it to get from one place to another. But now, because of Harry Potter, it's a destination. So that's what I'd like to say about the flying car, which wasn't really about the flying car at all, but it's sort of this symbol of course magic happens at King's Cross, because that's your entrance into the country, and it's the place where you make your connection and you want to go there. And obviously this has only increased because of the film since then. So and it's just cool because it's a flying car. That's what that's the other thing I'd like to say about it.
I guess it links to this other aspect of commercialization. We talked of commercialization of product, but actually we could talk about it in terms of space. If what you're saying is right, Chris, and as a fellow Londoner, I'm inclined to agree with you. And I can think of other spaces that the film commercialises, both, real spaces in, they're equally. There are lots of cathedrals around the country that are now visited by more tourists. Is it York it has a shot of Diagon Alley,
Gloucester.
and then if you go around York these days, there's full of Harry Potter shops and things like that. So there's the commercialisation of real spaces, and then there's also the kind of creation or the realisation of fictional spaces in things like the Hogsmeade in the Harry Potter tour, or which happens here, or indeed in the States, where there's Harry Potter World and things like that. So, yeah, do we have anything to say about the kind of that aspect of this film's appeal?
Heritage, maybe? This idea of sort of... the Harry Potter films are very good at using space, like heritage spaces, and I don't know what that says about there's this kind of push-pull in the films between... A lot of it is green screen, and that's part of its pleasure, of course, but there's a lot of the rhetoric around the films, which is... Hogwarts is this composite of Gloucester Cathedral and this space and this courtyard and this. So they're trying to kind of use English heritage, British heritage, this whole narrative of casting British actors, only having British directors after a certain point, and all the sorts of Britishness that gets folded into Harry Potter as now heritage. So I don't really know what I mean by heritage, but I just wonder whether the films are using heritage in a particular way.
I'd throw in childhood again, to use our sort of key word of the thing. And another thing you're talking about is that, King's Cross is now populated by... This is the real King's Cross. It's now populated by two people, usually, or two demographics. There's busy, frantic commuters trying to get their train home from the city, and families queuing up to go to Harry Potter. So I wonder if there's also that element where the adult world is claimed as spaces for childhood commercialisation again.
Right. And I think the whole Britishness is very much part of the construction of the Harry Potter series. It's it's just calling on this imperial imagination of, and British children's literature, like, is it's almost magical already. Because it represents... there's this fascination with British childhood, right? And it could be also because what is considered children's literature, that golden age, comes from Britain, where, you have the Industrial Revolution, so things like Secret Garden and the Velveteen Rabbits, like many of the Peter Pan, like many of these classics of childhood are set in Britain, and so there's this kind of appeal to it. But I think it's also significant that spaces get tied to films rather than their history, the history of, what King's Cross would be. And so it is this kind of flattening of space. And so you're going there now to see the Harry Potter, not like what it was earlier. And so space then seems totally malleable. You can make it to be whatever it is.
Literally, just as a kind of literal example of that, what Chris is talking about with the platform 9 3/4, it's not even a platform anymore. It's just a sort of space in the foyer. So there's not even a platform, and yet people are queuing and taking their photo. So, of course, it's fictional. It's not even a platform when there are clearly platforms in this station, and yet people are able, with their imagination, to make a wall malleable enough for it to be a photo opportunity. I think there's something to that. It's the logic of the staircases in the castle that keep moving. If exactly. Yeah.
I had a question about, just coming off of your point about British childhood, and I was going to ask about whether actually this is. I was actually going to ask about white British childhood, because I think what the film does really interestingly. There's one shot of a black student in almost the entire film, but also the whole conversation around essentially mixed race identity, because they're talking about mudbloods, they're talking about purebloods, and I think this came up when we did Sorcerer / Philosopher's Stone, and got the categories wrong because we were not as well versed in the Harry Potter lore as we were at the time. But I thought that scene was interesting because, one, it's sort of doing race without being explicit. Maybe this goes back to this idea of our optic unconscious, about difference and about heritage and genealogy. But it's also, I thought the whole scene was really downplayed, because at the same time you've got Ron vomiting up slugs. So you've got this really interesting conversation about mixed race identity. To paint it with a very broad brush, but it feels like that's what it's talking about, against the backdrop of a scene set inside Hagrid's hut where Ron spewing up these, and I don't know whether that sort of diluted some of the power of the scene, but I thought there was some really interesting conversations, and Hermione looks quite upset by this. But then it's also, again, in a film that's in a franchise that's very, very white, and uses darkness in very particular ways. Actually, Dementors, the way that darkness and the films become darker as well, as in terms of lighting and tone and stuff like this. So I just wondered if there was anything to say about the way that the film sort of does or does not do race with that through that conversation of mudbloods.
Right. I really don't think it's conscious about race at all, and I think it has a white mindset. It just thinks about in that sense, it doesn't think about the politics of race. So it's thinking about wizards and witches, but the language that is being used is very racialized. But I don't know, if Rowling kind of understands that. And it's true, and there's just one black character, and then there's Parvati Patel, these two who are just, and then she becomes the love interest. And I always thought maybe it was because of criticism that they got, and they wanted this kind of global market, right? And so then they put these characters in the film. But there is this character called Cho Chang.
Yeah.
Which to an Asian person just sounds like a ridiculous name. You just came up with an Oriental sounding name and you created a character like that. So I think it's a wide imagination.
It's narrower than that. It's not just white. It's middle class whiteness. So it's actually to get localized in terms of Englishness, it's southern. It's basically Surrey, just outside London, commuter belt, wealthy, green pasture whiteness. Because there's not even any sort of, Chris, you say, of course it goes from King's Cross. I suspect you could also argue, of course it goes from King's Cross because all infrastructure in this country goes from London. There's no northern people, there's no working class people. I guess Ron Weasley, the Weasleys are the best gesture we've got, but actually they seem to live in this relatively idyllic kind of rural cottage that's a little bit higgledy-pickledy, and they have to hand me down some robes. But there doesn't seem to be. There's economics is an inconvenience, but it's not a hardship necessarily. They have to endure. Yeah. So it's narrower than that, and then you're right. But we get these extremely racially charged terms that seem to be drawing sort of more on kind of the legacy of kind of Holocaust and World War II and anti-Semitism, which again, in terms of Britishness, has a certain I don't know what the right term is, to be careful with my language, but there's a certain distancing that immediately goes into that, right? In the part of the British national myth is that we're the heroes in this story of racial oppression. So yes, it is extremely narrow in its focus, and I think these first two movies, in particular, in a franchise that doesn't get much better as it goes along, but yeah.
I only have two things to say. One, and this will definitely get cut, but someone I went to university with and did my undergraduate degree, got down to the last two for Cho Chang. That's my little factoid.
Oh, there is. I was like, that just sounds so odd.
But yeah, fine. And I suppose the second thing is that I actually agree. I had not thought that it's almost too easy to transplant mudbloods or discussion of mudbloods onto race, because that gives the film a bit of kind of credit. Well, actually, what the film ends up doing is making whiteness the victim again, because because Hermione is the victim of this. So it would be I see what you mean. This kind of, I guess, what D'Angelo would call a sort of white racial frame here, where everything is being understood through its effect on whiteness. So actually, it uses a very racialized language, but that doesn't mean it's conscious about, it's color conscious. It's using racial language to talk about difference, because that's often how we talk about difference, right? That's the biggest way that people are different from us. So it makes perfect sense that the film would use that language to signal difference, even if the outcome is that there's a white victim here, where Hermione is really put out by this challenge to her or this unveiling of her genealogy. So it can use racial language or racialized language without saying absolutely anything meaningful about race, because, as we know, the franchise doesn't, because it calls its characters Cho Chang. But there we go.
I think we're about out of time, which is a real shame, because I think there's so much more we could say about the film. And the film, actually, just to say, because we've been quite down on it, and I think for lots of very important reasons. But actually, I must say, the film struck me as a lot darker and a lot more mature than I remember it being, particularly in comparison with the first movie. There is a sort of foreboding tension that's very well handled in the film that we haven't really dealt with in that kind of, the murder plot of all this kind of the scary Chamber of Secrets. But perhaps another time and another episode. Jyotsna, what are you working on right now? Are there any projects you can tell us about, or any articles, ideas, thoughts percolating that listeners might want to hear about?
So I've just finished a piece that's coming out in a philosophy journal called The Acorn. And this is on Janusz Korczak, who is a Polish Jewish communist who was also a pediatrician. He's the person who writes the first children's Bill of Rights in 1920s. Then he got pushed into the Warsaw Ghetto, and he ends up taking care of 200 children in his orphanage, and then is led to the concentration camp and dies with the children. Or is murdered with the children. But they perform a play by Rabindranath Tagore, who's an Indian writer, and the play is called Post Office, and they perform that play in the ghetto. And so what we have about that performance are just notes from Korczak's diary, or a little, like, some people describing it. And so I was just reimagining why he chose that play and how it may have resonated in that space. And I think it is dealing with this, how do you prepare children for death? Just sort of this question that Korczak is asking. And I think in choosing a play from another time and another place, he's in a way showing to children that, you're part of this continuity, you will not be forgotten. I mean, there are lines in the play which are about, you will not be forgotten, we will not forget you. So how art can, in a way, help, because it is the label of humans, and it can keep your memory.
Really interesting.
That's what
that sounds really interesting. And actually, I mean, just to sort of link back to what we've been talking about, we didn't talk about death, and of course, death is another thing we could talk about in relationships with how this film engages with childhood, because it's very interested in that. But that sounds like an extremely interesting film. That's out in. Did you say it's in the philosophy journal?
Yes, it's called Acorn. It should be coming out soon. It's just in the publishing
All right. Well,
stage.
listeners in the future, do check it out. I'm sure it's a fascinating article. I'm looking forward to reading it. And thank you so much for your time today and for joining us on the show to chat about Chamber of Secrets.
No, thank you. I learned a lot just talking with you both. It was great. Thank you.
We won't edit that out. We'll keep that bit in, Alex. We'll keep that bit in.
Oh, no.
Yeah, won't cut that out.
Absolutely, that's staying in. All the stuff about our own egos, that's staying in. That's the message we've learned from our conversation today. No, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And the franchise will continue, and we'll do more in future episodes. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. You can also find our back catalogue of of podcasts and blogs at fantasy-animation.org. Do check us out, and by all means listen to Philosopher's Stone. If you're completely lost in the franchise already, go back, start again, and we'll see you for episode 3, Prisoner of Azkaban. Otherwise, take care and we'll see you next time.
Bye.